Welcome to the Politics of Everything. I'm Amber Daines, your host and podcast producer. This is a half hour of power, a podcast dropping every week where I unpack the politics of everything, from money to motherhood, nutrition to narcissism, startups to secularism, the environment, quality, and much, much more. Our guests are seasoned in the field or topic of their choice, even if you've not heard of them yet. This is a non-partisan show. So while I love exploring varied views and get a buzz from a healthy debate of ideas, this is not a purely blue, white, green program. Please subscribe, tune in and enjoy the politics of everything. Hi listeners, this is a bonus episode for 2024 and will be our last episode of the Politics of Everything for now. For those who have followed the tortuous path of Australian climate policy over recent decades, a 2024 report by the Australian Energy Market Commission of a shadow price of, in Australian dollars, $70 a tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent elicits some painful memories. I had to find the right person to dive into such a big topic, so enter the chat Ross Garnaut, who, if you're an economics tragic like me, will definitely be a household name. In brief, Ross is a professorial research fellow in economics at the University of Melbourne. In 2008, he produced Garnaut Climate Change Review for the Australian Government. He's the author of many books, including the best-selling Dog Days, Superpower and Reset. Drawing on his unrivaled expertise in economics, industrial development and climate change, Ross makes the case for a levy on the big polluters that will help fund Australia to become a carbon-free energy giant, lower the cost of living and assist the world to cut emissions. He has a new book out called Let's Tax Carbon and Other Ideas for a Better Australia, where he examines Australia's economic history, breaking down which policies have worked and which haven't. He critiques the current Albanese government's first term and presents a set of policies that he argues can deliver full employment with rising incomes for a growing Australian population. As well as analysing Australian monetary and fiscal policy, Let's Tax Carbon also looks overseas to the consequences of Trump and Biden's economic policies and how countries like China, Japan and the US are responding to climate change. And so I warmly welcome Ross to the Politics of Everything. Thanks for joining me.
Hello, Amber. Very good to be with you and your listeners in the last podcast before Christmas.
Podcasting remotely can be challenging, but it doesn't have to be. Since day one of the Politics of Everything, I have relied on Zencastr's all-in-one solution to make the process quick and painless, the way it should be for those of us who just love great content and want to get our ideas out into the world. If you know me, I'm obsessed with quality in terms of my guests, my sound, and everything about my show has to be great the first time. I'm time poor. It's so easy to use Zencastr. I'm not tech savvy and you don't need to be either. There's nothing to download. Just click on the link and off we go. Zencastr is all about making your podcasting experience easy, and with everything from local recording to automatic post-productions now in their toolkit, you don't have to leave your browser to get that episode done, and done fast. I have a special offer for you, and hopefully you can experience what I have with Zencastr. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my VIP code, the Politics of Everything, all lowercase in one word, to get 30% off your first 3 months of Zencastr Professional. How good is that? I want you to have the same easy experiences I do for all my podcasting and content needs. It's time to share your story. I'm really excited, and I really am an economics nerd. Believe it or not, if I hadn't become a journalist in my career, my other thing was I wanted to be an economist. So I feel like with journalism, I got to do a little bit of economic stuff. I was a business journo for a number of years, but I certainly don't have the economic credentials you do. So it's really great to have you on the show. But I will ask you my first question, which I ask all my guests. What did young Ross want to be? I don't suppose economist was necessarily on your plans when you were a high school student, but I could be wrong. Can you remember what you thought you might do?
Oh, no, it happened just step by step, Amber. I didn't have any grand career strategy. I happened to get a scholarship to the ANU after school. I was at school in Perth, at Perth Modern School, and it seemed interesting to go to Canberra to study economics. I was interested in a lot of things. I'd actually been very interested in physics up until then, and I, for a little while, wondered if I'd regret not studying physics, because in the early 60s it seemed that physics was going to be the science that sorted everything else, everything out, told us what reality was all about. I don't regret the decision, but I can't say that it was a purposeful, deliberate decision. I got into it and have found the life of an economist interesting enough to keep me there.
Absolutely. Well, you've had a long career in it, so you must have found your thing, which is great because a lot of people that I speak to, they might have 2 or 3 different types of career and then they get to something that, is what they're meant to be doing, what lights them up. But you've obviously been able to stay the course and, do really well with it, which is a fantastic thing to look back on, I imagine.
Yes, and I've had interesting things to do right through my career. I suppose the binding theme holding it all together is an interest in economic development in Australia and its Asian neighbourhood, and that's been changing enough to keep it interesting. And then in these last 17 years, since all the premiers and then the Prime Minister joining the premiers gave me the job of looking at policy on climate change, and that was a new interest, actually very closely related to my old ones, but different enough to keep me going.
Excellent. Look, this topic of taxing carbon, it feels like one of those prickly areas of Australian politics. It's stymied, or worse still, toppled former prime ministers and other leaders for the past 15 years or so. It seems to be something that gets kind of shunned a little bit. The words don't kind of come out of any politician's mouth that I can hear of. We might package it differently. I'm in the world of comms. I know how to do that. But this idea that we need to tax carbon and head towards a zero carbon economy, it seems like something in this book, which you've written, it can be a reality rather than a pipe dream. Why do you think so? Why is this the path you think Australia should be taking?
Well, I don't think it was ever the political negative that it's now remembered as. Julia Gillard's government introduced carbon pricing, and it worked very well. Emissions came down at the rate they should have, at 8% per annum for the sectors covered by the emissions trading scheme. If we'd kept on like that, we'd be headed towards net zero by 2050, which the Morrison government promised the international community that we'd get to. And it did that without disrupting industry at all. There were careful arrangements put in place around the Gillard scheme that made sure that our industries weren't disadvantaged by competition with other countries that didn't have similar arrangements. It also looked after the incomes of people on lower and middle incomes. So it increased the tax-free threshold, which meant that all workers had lower taxation, especially those at the lower end of the income distribution. It adjusted social security so that no one in Australia on average or low incomes was disadvantaged, and some actually were better off as a result. It gave a lot of revenue to the budget, $7 billion that financed those things, and also was put into the Renewable Energy Agency and Clean Energy Finance Corporation to get the new industries going. So it worked very well. And I don't think Tony Abbott won the election in 2013 because of the carbon price. It won the election in 2013 because the Labor Party was fighting itself.
Well, that wasn't a helpful period in politics. And of course, we can't go back. We can only go forward and move from where we are today. And we have had, for any overseas listeners, Australia's had a series of conservative and, if you like, left-leaning governments and everything in between in the past 15 years or so. So it feels like we've never really got momentum on this issue. So how do you think Australia can lead the way in key areas like the energy transition, which we talk about a lot, to make us considered, more than, I guess, pulling our weight? I often think Australia, it's not an economic powerhouse like US or China, but we can do our bit. How do we do that right, in your view?
Well, we can do a lot more than our bit. In the new economy, the zero carbon economy, that all the countries of the world have committed to, we've all agreed in the United Nations that we'll take steps that will cause the world as a whole to be net zero by 2015, net zero carbon emissions. Now, Mr. Trump has promised to pull out of it. He'll be his will be the only government that is not in the Paris Agreement with the commitment to net zero by 2050 for the world as a whole, if he does take that step. But at the moment, we're all in it. And in that world, we'll need a lot of renewable energy, and we'll need a lot of sustainably grown biomass plants. And it happens that Australia is the best place in the world for renewable energy and for sustainably growing biomass. So we are the natural home for a very large part of global industry in the zero carbon world economy. In the world of fossil carbon, we were pretty well endowed. We had a lot of coal and a lot of gas compared with our population, so we were a big exporter. Coal, we were competitors with Indonesia and some others. Oil and gas, we were competitors with the Middle East, Russia, and some others. Compared to the world as a whole, we're much better off with resources in the new world of zero carbon. Our solar and wind is that good. And just as in the old world, the countries with a lot of industry and high incomes and not many fossil carbon resources had to import a lot to sustain their standards of living in their industry. Europe and Japan and China and Korea had to import a lot of oil and gas and coal. In the new world, those countries also lack renewable energy resources and sustainably grown biomass. And so we'll have to import a lot from countries like Australia. And Australia is much better placed than any other country in this world. We weren't the very best place in the fossil carbon world. Some of the Middle East countries, Saudi Arabia and so on, were even better placed than us. But we're top of the league in the new world. And in the old world, you could export gas or coal or oil. And that was quite a good industry. It helped Australian incomes, but it wasn't the source of advantage in industrial activities because it was almost as our coal and our gas was almost as cheap, sometimes cheaper in the countries that were importing it than here. It was cheaper to use Queensland coal in steelworks in Japan or China or Korea than it was to use it in steelworks in Whyalla. The transport costs were actually lower, but it's completely different in the zero carbon world. It's very expensive to move electricity, renewable electricity across continents or across the sea between continents. You can do it, but it's expensive. Very high cost transmission cables. You can turn it into hydrogen and take the hydrogen, but that's also very much more expensive in the importing countries than it is in Australia. So the natural tendency, the forces of economics will drive us to use our renewable energy resources and biomass to support industry in Australia. And that's just going to be a huge economic advantage. And the new industries exporting goods made from renewable energy and biomass, these industries are going to be much bigger export industries than coal and gas exports in the old economy.
Absolutely. And I think you've explained that very clearly. In the introduction I did mention this idea of this shadow carbon price, which I mentioned from that report in March 2024 from the Australian Energy Market Commission, basically saying it's not a cost to be paid by carbon emitters, and it's an estimate of that marginal cost of meeting Australia's emission targets, and that $70 a tonne figure will be included when calculating the benefits and costs of the rule changes. How does that approach fit in or not fit in with what you're talking about?
Well, what that says is that their estimate is that what you could call the social cost of carbon, the cost of the damage that carbon does, is about $70 a tonne per carbon dioxide. Now, if the economies of the world are working efficiently, then you'll keep reducing carbon emissions until the cost of reducing another tonne is equal to the damage you avoid with a tonne of carbon. These calculations, the social cost of carbon, been done in a lot of countries. $70 is a pretty low estimate. I think as a working example of a realistic cost of carbon, the current European carbon price is probably as close as we get. That's about $100 Australian a tonne, about 4 times as high as the Australian carbon price under the Julia Gillard scheme. And that will have to rise over time. It has to rise enough to provide incentives, to provide alternatives to goods made from coal and oil and gas. So the value of reducing carbon, the social cost of carbon, will end up, I think, being higher than $70 a tonne. What was suggested in the report to which you referred is that in calculating whether some measures are worthwhile when you don't have a carbon price. They will do the calculations as if the social cost of carbon was about $70, and they will use regulations to ensure that we act as we would have done if we had a $70 carbon price. That's one way of doing it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, well, that's one way of doing it, but actually having a carbon price is a more efficient way of doing it.
So, as well as analysing Australian monetary and fiscal policy, your latest book, Let's Tax Carbon, also looks overseas. And I think we talk about, obviously, at the time you wrote the book, it was both, the Trump and Biden's economic policies kind of interplaying and looking at how countries like China, Japan, the US are going to respond to climate change. You did mention the big thing, which is that we now have Trump presidency 2.0 coming in January next year. And the likelihood is he's going to pull the US out of that agreement. Does this change the game at all because there's such a big player, or can Australia really just keep moving forward without that kind of consensus, if you like?
Well, it might not change things much if all we see is American policy changing. Where it will be really damaging is if it had a big influence on other countries. If for example, Australian policy or Japanese policy or European policy changed in the Trump direction, if there was that sort of influence. I don't think there necessarily will be, although there's some risk of that. If there's not, then America pulling itself out of the international activity may not mean so much. America was never going to be an important market for Australian exports in the zero carbon world because it's got reasonably good renewable energy resources of its own. Not as good as ours, even though it's a much bigger economy. Their resources are not as good as ours. And of course, it's such a big economy that it will need all of that renewable energy itself. So it's always going to be more or less self-sufficient under the Biden policies. Now, if the US pulls out of the Paris Agreement and it removes all of the incentives for zero carbon production under the Inflation Reduction Act and other measures that President Biden put in place, that may slow down decarbonisation in America, but it won't have a big on the rest of the world. America is quite important in the world, 8% of global emissions, but the emissions that Australia will reduce for the world as a whole are actually even bigger than that by exporting green iron, green aluminium to replace metals made from coal and gas in Europe and Northeast Asia. So it's a modest part of the world. And it's even doubtful whether President Trump will succeed in repealing those acts because a lot of the industrial development in the United States, energy and industrial development associated with renewable energy, has helped employment and incomes in states that are strong Trump supporters. I was at a meeting right in the middle of Queensland in the town of Barcaldine a couple of months ago, a conference, and they'd invited over the mayors of the central west of Queensland and invited over the 7 visitors from the central west of Texas. And the message there was whether or not you think climate change is a problem worth worrying about, the huge investment in renewable energy has been great for rural and provincial development in the central west of Texas. And so the Texan visitors, 7 of them, all had the message, do this because it's great for development in sparsely populated areas of the state under good sun and wind like the central west of Queensland. Do it for economic development, even if you don't care about climate change. So President Trump will have his job cut out in trying to get Texan senators and Congress people to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act and reverse all of that development.
So absolutely. And I suppose, though, to win the election, he had lines like drill, baby, drill. And that really appealed to his broad base, if you like, of this idea of an old America, including old style energy from oil and gas, remaining firmly on his economics agenda. And you've obviously written some op-eds since his win about what that really means. But it feels like he can say all the stuff, but progress away from that is still likely, and that's kind of, is that where you've landed on that?
Yeah, I think we'll have to wait and see. But I think you'll have a battle getting rid of the Inflation Reduction Act. And also in the United States, as in Australia, a lot of the effective action is at a state level.
Yes.
And a lot of the states of America remain very strongly committed to reducing emissions. The big state of California has very strong domestic laws of its own, and many other states do. So we'll just have to wait and see. But I don't think that the election of Trump will necessarily greatly change what happens inside the US, and it certainly won't affect Australian opportunity, because the superpower opportunity for Australia, the opportunity to export goods using our renewable energy and biomass, never depended on the American market. The most important markets are right now in Northeast Asia and Europe, Japan, China, Korea in Northeast Asia, in Europe, the European Union, the Scandinavian countries, and Britain outside the European Union. Later, we'll find that Southeast Asia and South Asia, Indonesia, India, other countries in those regions, will become important markets. The United States was never going to be an important part of the story.
Interesting. I love that perspective. Here's hoping. I'm changing tack a little bit. I've got 3 questions, which I always wrap up my interview with all my guests. So my first one, and so far, what's been your biggest life lesson to date, and what has it taught you? And it doesn't just have to be career focused. It could have been something in your personal life that has really stuck with you and I guess had an impact.
Oh, I think the death of my mother when I was a primary school boy had the biggest impact. Took me a very long time to adjust to. So just asking the question like that, what's had the biggest impact?
Oh, of course. And I am sorry.
That stands out against everything else.
Absolutely. And how do you define your own version of success? I imagine someone who's got to where you have in your career, I mean, you don't need to keep working. A lot of people probably of your vintage would be looking at playing golf and retiring. You're still very busy and very much part of those political conversations which are going to move the needle on this. What is success now for you?
Well, there's no sacrifice for me not to play golf. I don't particularly
Or choose whichever hobby you'd like to insert.
And I do indulge myself in front at an AFL game, and I'll be there.
You wouldn't be a Melburnian if you didn't do that, would you?
And I'll be there at the Boxing Day Test. So, I find that working on these things interesting, and I don't think that in a lifetime in public policy, economic policy, I've come to the view that no important battles of ideas are ever won quickly or ever won forever. It's an ongoing process, and it's only through committed citizens remaining engaged in the discussion of policy, continuing to work on the issues and contribute to the debates about them, that we make any progress. I say in the book, in the chapter called "The Economic Consequence of Mr. Lowe," which was originally the Manning Clark lecture at the ANU in honour of the great Australian historian Manning Clark, I quote Manning Clark as saying, "Every individual life is a failure, but humanity succeeds. We all make our little contributions, even alongside lots of failures of attempted contributions. But the little positive things that lots of people add mean that generation by generation, on the whole, humanity's done better. We're better off as human society now than I say in the book, than we were 80 years ago, or 800, or 8,000, or 80,000 years ago. So that's how we should see each of our contributions. It makes life interesting and rewarding to participate in the processes, and we shouldn't ever expect to have the decisive victories that make things good forever. That's not how things work. If we make a bit of a difference at the margin, and lots of other people do the same thing, then humanity can gradually succeed.
So profound. I don't think anyone's given that kind of answer for that question. So that's an awesome piece of advice and I guess perspective. Just a final takeaway message for us as we wrap up our conversation today on the politics of taxing carbon.
Yeah, well, I think that Australia has an immense opportunity. I make quite a lot in the book of how badly we've done in the last 10 years on general economic policy. We've had stagnant living standards. Real wages have fallen. We've been near the bottom of the developed world on productivity growth and growth in average output since Tony Abbott got rid of carbon pricing a decade ago. And we should reflect upon that and getting the climate transition right, making use of Australia's immense advantages in the zero carbon world from our renewable energy resources and potential for growing biomass, that can put Australians back on a path of rising living standards after a decade of stagnation.
Fantastic. Well, it's been a great conversation. Of course, if anyone is interested, there will be some details of how to contact Ross, his website, and of course, this fabulous new book on my show notes. Until next time, everyone, take care. Thanks so much for listening today. If you've enjoyed the politics of everything, I thrive on your feedback. So please add a short review and share the podcast with your network through Apple, Spotify, and all the usual suspects. I'm always on the hunt for new and diverse guests, so if you or someone you know has a fresh idea you're busting to get out there, please email me at amber@amberdanes.com and my crew will get back to you very soon.